Let's turn to a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. My name is Ariel ben-Lyman, HaNaviy. Let's take 30 minutes and discuss this topic of wisdom in the book of Proverbs. The verse reads from the NIV's version that biblicalunitarian.com is borrowing. I, wisdom, was appointed from eternity from the beginning. And when I click on the verse, or the link on their website, they offer a commentary on this particular passage. I was appointed from eternity from the beginning before the world began, the NIV. According to biblicalunitarian.com, which is a website about God and His Son, Jesus Christ, they are a non-Trinitarian Christian denomination that believes that God the Father is the only God and there is no God the Son nor God the Spirit. They are non-Trinitarian, similar to other non-Trinitarian groups out there, Christadelphians, Oneness Pentecostals, Iglesia de Cristo, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, or Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So there are a lot of non-Trinitarian groups out there, and this particular group, Biblical Unitarian, along with their kind of umbrella organization, just Unitarianism, rejects Trinity. There are not three persons in the Godhead. There's one God, and then Jesus either is a demigod, a creature that was created by God before the creation of the world, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, who are the modern-day versions of Arians, or some say that Jesus is actually the Father, like the Oneness Pentecostals. So the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are really all just one being that wear three different masks. So it's the Oneness Pentecostals are the modern versions of ancient modalists. Or we have a perspective like the Unitarians, particularly biblical Unitarians, who believe that Jesus is merely a human being. And God is the Father, He's God. Jesus is a human, He's not divine, He's not deity. And the Holy Spirit is just another name for God, or it's the power that God anoints we human beings with. And this view of Biblical Unitarian, the modern Biblical Unitarians, are really resemble the ancient day Socinians, which held this view as well. We, by contrast and comparison, believe that God is one, yet God is three persons, all co-equal, all consubstantial, and yet three persons, one God, three persons. So neither is lesser than the other in terms of nature and substance or power, being, authority, etc., etc. But when it comes to a bit of dealing with the persons and the economy of God, what we might call the hierarchy of God, as God the Father sends the Son and begets the Son, right? The Son is begotten of the Father, therefore one is Father, one is Son. There's no confusion there between who is who is whom, which one is which one. And likewise, the Holy Spirit is issued forth, or the procession of the Spirit, we might call it, goes forth from Father and Son, or depending on which filioque side of the debate which side of the filioque debate you want to land on, He's only issued from the Father, not the Son. But either way, there's a bit of a kind of a hierarchy in the economy of God when we're talking about the roles and functions that each plays in the biblical narrative. So we're looking at Proverbs chapter 8, specifically verse 23 in primary, but we backed up to verse 22, and we're reading all the way down through verse 25 in my own notes here. So when we look at the verse in earnest, on your screen, we've got verse 22, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of His way, before His works of old. And in the Hebrew, the word that's rendered from the English as possessed is this Hebrew word kanani. And this word kanani is translated as possessed, but we're also finding that there are different ways to translate this just in verse 22. Primarily in verse 23, from everlasting I was established from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. And this is the verse we've kind of been focusing on, which reads in the Hebrew, Me'olam nisachti me'rosh mikadme aretz. In the English, we've got I was established. But in the Hebrew, we've got this word nisachti, and we've been looking at this root word nasach. Does it mean that he was created? Was he established? Was he set up? It was definitely at the beginning, because he says me'olam. And it's at the beginning. He parallels that with from the beginning. So the word me'olam at the beginning of the verse, which is translated into English as everlasting, is paralleled with merosh, which is translated as beginning in the second half of the verse, right? So it's poetic parallelism going on here, obviously. But what is the meaning of this verb, of this word, nisachti, nasach? What does this verb mean to be set up or to be established? Likewise, when we get to verse 24 and 25, there are two words that are brought into the discussion in poetic fashion that also speak of wisdom being, as it were, entering the scenes. The word is brought forth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. The Hebrew word, as I'm highlighting on your screen, is cholalti, and it's the same word that shows up two times in the two verses, 24 and 25. Both use the same phrase. Before the when there were no depths, I was brought forth, and then before the hills, I was brought forth. Cholalti being used in both times. But let's go back to verse 23. From everlasting, I was established. That's where we left off with our discussion last week. Let's pick up our discussion. Oops. This is a screen I showed last week. I won't dwell too much on it, but it's kind of the dilemma that's faced by the Jehovah's Witness, who say that really what's at stake is if wisdom is Jesus, like Trinitarians say. Remember, Biblical Unitarian, well, you may not remember because I didn't give you a reminder. Biblical Unitarian, I apologize for not mentioning this earlier. Biblical Unitarian says that wisdom in this passage is not Jesus. Because this wisdom is spoken of as being with God from time immemorial, from eternity, etc., they say that wisdom is merely a personification of God's power and God's one of God's immutable attributes that he cannot do without. Therefore, it's not that wisdom is something that God was lacking, that he had to create, like the Jehovah's Witness view of Jesus being created as an agent before the world was even created. So remember, the Jehovah's Witness model is that Jesus was created first by God, and then so God created Jesus, and then Jesus created the rest of the world, the rest of the universe, and everything else. So that's why God can be called a creator in some passages, and Jesus can be called a creator in other passages. They can have their cake and eat it too by saying that Jesus is the creator of everything else. And indeed, they alter their rendering of certain passages, like when Paul talks about that by him and for him and through him all things were created, like in Colossians. The Jehovah's Witnesses alter that passage to say by him and for him and through him everything else was created, instead of saying everything, all things. They have everything else. They insert the idea that it's not himself, that he didn't create himself, but everything else was created by him. All right. The Biblical Unitarians, by contrast, say, no, Jesus was not created at the beginning of the world. He was not this agent that God used to create everything. He was not around at the creation of the world. Where was Jesus? He was in the mind of God. That's all. And so all those passages that talk about by him, before him, and through him, all things were created, etc., it's only referring to the thought that was in God's head, to where he was focusing on the Son when he was actually creating everything. Therefore, since the Son was the focal point in God's power, when creation was springing forth from God's hand, then that's why the verses read the way they do about Jesus seemingly being the creator. No, it's not Jesus the being that was the creator, according to Biblical Unitarian. No, it's not Jesus the human being. It was merely Jesus the thought. That's what created the world. Therefore, really, it's God that created everything. Well, then in Proverbs, wisdom cannot be Jesus, because God has always possessed wisdom. God has always been in possession of wisdom. It wasn't something he created at the beginning. He was not lacking wisdom. Therefore, Biblical Unitarian soundly rejects Jehovah's Witness perspective as well as the Trinitarian perspective. So given that dilemma for Jehovah's Witness, given the fact that they are rejected both by Biblical Unitarians as well as Trinitarians, they say they're stuck in this pickle between, if you look at this question, okay, so do you believe that Jehovah lacked wisdom at some point in time? if Jesus is wisdom that God had to create, right? Jesus wasn't on the scene for eternity, but God brought him into the scene. And therefore, if Jesus is wisdom, then wisdom had to be created by God at some point in time. Would then Jehovah lacked wisdom at some point in time? Jehovah's Witness says if they say yes, then the conclusion leads to the fact that God isn't all wise, right? Well, they can't have that because that's a dilemma. God is not all wise in their model if they say yes to the question that God had to create wisdom because he lacked it. But if they say, no, he didn't lack wisdom at some point in time, then we can say, well, then so Jesus, if he's wisdom, then he is eternal, right? Remember, the pickle for Jehovah's Witness is that at the bottom of this little chart that you're seeing, this graphic, is that they cannot admit to either the yes or no conclusion. They cannot admit that God isn't all wise, nor can they admit that Jesus is eternal. They're stuck in between a rock and a hard place if they go either direction. And then lastly, if it's personification, like the biblical Unitarians say, if the Jehovah's Witnesses say, well, no, it's just personification. That's not really Jesus, it's just personification. Well, if it is personification, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, if that's true, but all of these passages that you see on your screen that I'm not going to take time to go through and look up, but I'll leave this slide on the screen long enough for you guys to look it up on your own, look all the passages up, then how come all those other passages don't make the Holy Spirit a person? Is that what's going on? Remember, Jehovah's Witnesses, along with Biblical Unitarian, reject the idea that the Holy Spirit is a person, and yet Proverbs is only personification, or it is Jesus, right? So there are aspects to whichever perspective you take. You're going to find that from my perspective as a Trinitarian, I'll go ahead and tell you right up front, I believe that the book of Proverbs is talking about, it is employing the tool of personification on one aspect, but on the aspect, it is also showing us that Jesus is the eternal one who self-existed with the Father alongside God from eternity past. He is the eternal creator. God did not create him. So both aspects are true of Jesus. Wisdom is Jesus personified, but yet Jesus is very God, existing alongside God in eternity past. So I take that perspective, which some Trinitarians would say Proverbs is only personification and not Jesus, and other Trinitarians would say Proverbs is Jesus, wisdom is Jesus. It's not merely personification, it truly is Jesus, because we have a passage in the New Testament where Jesus is talked about as the wisdom of God. So we're working in that, we're working towards that. And we're also working towards reading through a part of the book of John where John parallels wisdom with the Logos, the Word, right? In the beginning was the Word, which we're working our way towards that. But let's finish looking through my commentary first. We left off here talking about this idea of the definition of Nasach, and how it emphasizes the eternal nature of God. So I backed up just one paragraph because it's the last paragraph we read. This is my own commentary, which is not available online anywhere. If you want to follow along with this particular short essay, you can only do so by watching this video series. So here we go. At this point in time, throughout the rest of the commentary, I'm going to try and resist stopping and interjecting my own thoughts, because this is my own thoughts, so should be self-explanatory. You ready? Here we go. Here's what I had to say. Despite the differences in interpretation, the word nasach, right, in verse 23, from everlasting I was established, from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. Let's highlight those so you can see them both. So, or highlight them so you can see it a little bit bigger, blow it up on the screen. So this is verse 23 in Proverbs 8 in the English NASB. And the word that we're focusing on is this word that's rendered established in the NASB version here in the English. We go over to the Hebrew, it's, there we go, it's that word right there. Me'olam nisachti me'rosh mikadme aretz. From everlasting I was established, or Yeah, the English word established. And then from the beginning, Mirosh, Mikad Me'ar, it's before the world was set up, or from the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth. So that's the verse in question that we're really kind of looking at. I go on to say, the divine origin of wisdom, which was established by God before the creation of the world, is what I believe is being emphasized. It's because of the parallelism between the two words of before the world began, and let me just show you to you again, from everlasting here and from the earliest times here. Both of these words are used in parallel fashion to describe, in the Hebrew mindset, something that took place prior to the creation. And in the Hebrew worldview, there's only two chambers or two spheres of existence. I'll put a little graphic on the chart like I've done in the past. On the left side of the Hebrew mind, there is a creator, and he exists in a sphere or a place, what we might call a mode of existence that is eternal. There is no beginning for the creator. And in this place called creator on the left side of the screen that you're going to see in post-production, there's God, Son, there's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They're all God. They're all equally eternal because they exist in this sphere, in this dimension that is outside of our own as humans, because we exist in the one that's on the right that you're going to see in a moment. Well, so there's creator on the left side in this dimension, and on the right side there's everything else. There's creation. So there's creator on the left and creation on the right, and creation includes everything else, and that's everything that's temporal. Everything that's finite. So it's really just a distinction between infinite on the left and finite on the right. Eternal on the left and not eternal on the right. Well, when the writers of the Bible would use words like everlasting and earliest times of the earth and things like that, they're describing times that are outside of time. They're describing pre-time. They're describing the eternal state. And so everlasting was when I was established, or that's where I dwelt, that's where I lived, meaning wisdom was not created, was not something that didn't exist. It's poetic to say it was established, but what does established mean? That's kind of where we're going.